Okay, welcome to the STORR lecture. It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Fatimah Jackson. I know some of you were here yesterday, so you heard my introduction yesterday. So there's going to be some of the same things that I'm going to say. Yeah, we're really fortunate to have Professor Jackson here, coming from Washington, D.C., and spending some time with us, giving these two talks, but also interacting with people on campus. Yeah, and we're grateful to the STORR endowment for making all of this possible. So Professor Jackson was trained in anthropology and biology, and she received all of her degrees, so her bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. from Cornell University. And then after receiving her Ph.D., she went on to teach and conduct research at a number of different institutions. So she was first at UC Berkeley, so pretty close to home here. And then she went on to the University of Florida, then the University of Maryland, College Park, then the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and then now she's at Howard University in Washington, D.C. So she's a professor of biology at Howard, and she's also a senior scientist at Quad Grid Data Lab, and I think she's going to talk about some of the analyses, that data analyses that she's been doing in conjunction with Quad Grid. So she's internationally known for a variety of different contributions. So her research is very interdisciplinary. I think that came across very well in yesterday's talk, but I think probably today as well. So she's internationally known for her work in anthropology, her work in biology, and also kind of in the interface with medicine as well. And she's worked on a lot of different topics. So one of them is population structure in peoples of African descent. She's worked on human-plant coevolution. She's worked on gene-environment interactions and thinking about the relationship between that and precision medicine. And I think importantly, she's also dealt with a lot of, or thought about and written about different ethical issues involved in thinking about ethical issues related to these different fields that she's working in. So today, she's going to talk about computational geospatial approaches to reconstruct the historic internal migrations of Africans during the millennia of enslavement. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jackson to Davis.
All right. How's that? Can you hear me okay? All right, very good. So thank you, Dr. Weaver, and thank you, University of California, Davis, for the wonderful hospitality you've shown me over the last 2 days. I've got to know this campus a little bit, and I wish I had been here instead of Berkeley. Whoops. I have a tendency, especially after 2 o'clock, to say exactly what I feel, which is I can usually get away with it, but bear with me. I'm an old lady. All right, so I want to talk about the computational methods that we're using. First, I should tell you, I actually have an Associate of Arts in Computer Sciences. Why did I get this? My husband and I finished at Cornell, then we came out to Berkeley, and we said, we need to take some classes. I think we were in the habit of taking classes, and so with that habit in mind, we took classes in programming so that we could code. And Of course, the coding at that time was RPG and some other assembly language is what I really liked because it was close to the machine. And so it was a little idiosyncratic, but I don't mind that because I am. So I thought we thought, oh, the computers are coming in. This is 1981. Computers are coming in. We really need to get on in front of the curve. So we'll take these classes, and we didn't do anything with them. But I was director of the Cobb Research Lab, and then I had an ethical dispute with the vice president for research who wanted to give away the samples to Smithsonian. And you just don't give away your stuff to the federal government. I mean, you just don't do that, because you're not going to get it back, I tried to explain that to him. He said, no, it'll be great. It'll be Howard at Smithsonian. I said, that's not what's going to happen. So I'm out. And I decided, because you have to have intellectual stimulation, and here comes COVID, so we were all stuck at home. So I thought, what am I going to do? So then I said, oh, maybe I'll go back to my computational love. And of course, nobody was programming in assembly language, but it gave me a lot of clout in the community because people were using higher level languages. And so it wasn't that difficult to learn, R and Python and all these other little languages because they weren't that bad. And it was, they weren't as idiosyncratic as assembly language, in my opinion. What do I know, right? So the other thing I have to tell you is that I have 6 children, and my husband is an academic, and we had difficulty having colleagues when we started our careers. It was just difficult to get people to work with me. Now, at 20, I used to think I knew exactly why people wouldn't work with me, and I realized I don't know why. I mean, like Zornia Hurston said, I'm a lovely person. I'm really funny, and I like to be with people. Why wouldn't they work with me? But I think it was just, we're fearful of each other, and we're taught to be fearful and to be competitive with each other. And Berkeley was very competitive. And the Department of Anthropology was in total disarray, and so like in most places, when there's a fight at the top, when 2 elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers, which is an African saying. And I was part of the grass. I was an assistant professor, newly minted Ph.D. from Cornell, but was kind of getting kicked around. So my husband and I said, we're going to raise our kids to be academics, so we have colleagues. It's a new form of child labor. I just feel get your Ph.D. I need that mathematical equation solved. We also told them to marry Ph.D.s. So they're mostly complying because we said don't bring any dummies into the family. Now that was a mistake because you can be a dummy and have a Ph.D. We know that. But at least you can be employed if you have a Ph.D. So anyway, I said that to say that QuadGrid is my son's company, my son number 3. It's his company. And he has his Ph.D. in data science, and his wife is getting her Ph.D. in psychology, and I published with both of them, so it's all working out really well. Child labor. But these are the goals and objectives of our project, so I'll get into the science now. We wanted to build an inclusive database that considers ecological, evolutionary, demographic, and genomic features of continental Africa. We also wanted to use this database to identify the intercontinental migration routes of Africans during the 1,000 years that Africans have been exposed to enslavement, or let's call it predation, the predation of enslavement. And we wanted to identify the relevant African empires and kingdoms that facilitated these migrations. Because if you look at the history and you look at the enslavement patterns in Africa, not only the transatlantic slave trade, but also the trans-Saharan, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea slave trades. That's a whole lot of slave trades. And they're going on from 700 AD to 1900 AD. So it's over 1,000 years, over that. And that's what I'm calling the millennia of enslavement. And furthermore, when we looked at that, our tendency in the United States has been to say, yes, white people did this. Europeans did this. But how did they get into the interior? Because they didn't go into the interior. So how did they? Because the Africans didn't come from the coast, came from the interior of Africa. So that's where we said, what were the Africans doing? And of course, in Africa, you had empires and kingdoms, and those kingdoms lasted, persisted for the most part, up until the colonial powers replaced the African kingdoms with European kingdoms. You know, like the British kingdom, the French kingdom. Now we wanted to apply this database for the purposes of reconnecting and reconstructing patterns of genomic and non-genomic variation in African populations. We ultimately have been trying to figure out what is the genetic variation in Africans of the diaspora, especially the transatlantic diaspora, this place here in America. What is the genetic variation and where did it come from in Africa? And we weren't making a lot of progress because the African reference genetic database is very poor. It's spotty. And I just want to say that this is just a quick overview of the research that you can keep in mind as I go through the parts. We haven't finished the research, but we made enough progress for me to talk about a bit of what we've done. Predicting the origins of African-descended peoples in the Atlantic diaspora, it's really important to us. Why? Because here comes precision medicine. But if you don't know the ancestry of a population, you can't give them precision medicine. That's a joke. So, gosh, here we go again. You know, we're supporting something with our tax dollars from which we will derive little to no benefit. So we said, we want to be eligible for insights of biomedical significance, including precision medicine. We need to know the origins of African-descended peoples. I'll tell you that the dean of the College of Medicine, the former dean of the College of Medicine at Howard University, when I went to talk to him about genetics, and he said, I want to have the same level of care that Jimmy Carter got when he had cancer. And I said, do you realize that we actually knew Jimmy Carter's heritage? You know, that we just didn't give him experimental medicine. We had done a series of experiments. He's a physician. What does he know, right? About experimentation. He knows how to treat people, but it wasn't his area. And he didn't understand what was behind the success of the anti-cancer treatments for former President Jimmy Carter. Now, the application of machine learning, and I just learned machine learning a couple of years ago, so don't ask me any questions about machine learning. The application of machine learning to biological and historical databases has really increased. And we're finding that we can use these new models that I just learned about to accurately identify the African empires and kingdoms that were involved in the procurement, kidnapping, transport, and delivery of captive Africans for enslavement within and outside of Africa. And these machine learning models can be used to identify the ethno-regional sources of enslaved Africans. So that gets us a little closer to identifying the areas of origin of the descendants of those people who came to the Americas. You know, it's not foolproof, but it gets us closer to an idea of which geographical ranges were involved, which ethnic groups were involved, and if we can piece together the origins of African descended peoples in the Atlantic diaspora, then maybe we can start to save some of them. So we can alleviate some of the health disparities. So we can reduce the health inequities. It's not the sole solution, but it's part of the solution, is to know the people you're working with. Now, our analysis is grounded in the paradigm of the millennia of enslavement, which, as I mentioned, was 700 current era, or AD to 1900 of the current era. We could go back a little bit earlier, because actually the roots of enslavement are very deep in Africa. But, 700 seemed like a good starting date for picking up the millennia of enslavement. Furthermore, the millennia of enslavement involved 4 different major slave trades. And we focus a lot on the transatlantic, as if that's the only slave trade. But there's the Trans-Saharan, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea slave trades, as I mentioned. At this time, at the time of the millennia of enslavement, fragmented and compromised, AEK is African Empires and Kingdoms. That's my abbreviation for them. I don't know how it would be pronounced, ek. Anyway, AEKs became located close to the trade routes, so they're moving, in order to position themselves to optimize the collection of peoples and other resources, because they're not just exporting people out, but they're exporting gold and ostrich feathers and other things. In fact, many times it's those other commercial items that were the initiators of the trade, and then the people came later. And by the way, I just got some other people. Would you be interested in these people I have? There was regional variability in the cultural dominance of specific African empires and kingdoms, and the ethnic groups that were located in close proximity to powerful empires and kingdoms may have received some protection from predation. And I'm calling it predation because I'm an evolutionary biologist, and it looks like predation to me when you can't sit securely in your home and you think that somebody's going to come and grab your kid that you just sent to, to go milk the goats or something. Now, enslavement was opportunistic, and this resulted in greater diversity among the enslaved, with certain benefits for enslavers, like fewer rebellions. So there was a conscious effort on the part of the enslavers, both within Africa and outside of Africa, to keep their populations heterogeneous, so that they could not easily communicate with each other. Because the tendency for any human is to be free. We want to be free. We don't want people telling us what to do, and we don't want our autonomy compromised. Now, aggregation of the 4 major slave trades during the millennia of enslavement, it helps us better understand the diversity of origins of descendants of the survivors of these trades. And it helps us understand the magnitude of the gene pool that is captured during the process of the millennia of enslavement. Now, the first thing I want to show you is the true size of Africa, because Africa in our mind is like this. The real Africa is huge. You can fit 5 continental United States within Africa. But you can see here, I don't know if you can read the words, but there's China, there's the United States. China, United States, France is up here. So France is smaller than its colonial possessions in Africa. You guys familiar with this term punked out? Like where France punks out other people? It's not that big, but look, do I have, that's the Netherlands. Okay, here's Spain. I was looking for Britain. This is, I think, Japan down here. But I was looking for Britain, which is tiny, but has had access way disproportionate to its size. And so our interpretation has been, for a long time, that only these few regions were significant in terms of the transatlantic African diaspora. Senegambia, it starts at the top, Senegambia, then Sierra Leone, then Liberia, and then getting into the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, then the Bight of Benin, which would be right in here, okay? The Bight of Biafra over here, and around here, and then West Central Africa. So these were export ports, but the people themselves came from deeper into the interior, and we want to know where and how. So these are the key points. The millennia of enslavement encompasses these 4 trades. It expands the time frame that I discussed, and it expands the regional areas from which Africans were taken. So not just West Africa, but Central Africa, and East Africa, and South Africa, and even North Africa. Why is this? Well, you have to really give credit to the Arab and European slave owners, because the Europeans especially were very efficient. There were thousands of ships. I mean, they weren't playing. It was like a gold rush to collect Africans. And the thousands of slaves identified in the slave database meant that not only were they collecting from the Atlantic, but also from the Indian Ocean, and even going into the Mediterranean, where they had conflicts with the Ottomans, who were also enslaving, but the Ottomans stopped around 1850. They banned, the Sultan of Turkey banned slavery. In fact, I just learned that the first black pilot was an Ottoman whose grandmother had come from the African kingdom of Borneo, and was then shipped to the Ottoman Empire, and lived and survived in the Ottoman Empire as a slave until she was free, and then her daughter was born free, and that became the mother of the first black airline pilot. We're always talking about the Tuskegee Airmen and love the boys, but you know, we've had some successes elsewhere on the planet that we didn't even know about. I mean, this was the first time I heard about it. What this millennia of enslavement as a paradigm shift does is that it broadens the genomic base, which may be represented in the African diaspora. So now I want to show you what our conception of the millennia of enslavement was in terms of the exodus of African populations. Doesn't it look like an explosion? The Africans are coming out from all kinds of places, and that over 1,000 years, you've got movements of people across the Sahara. You've got movements of people down toward the Atlantic coast, movements of people down toward the Central African coast, movements of people out of Central Africa down towards Dar es Salaam. In fact, when I traced my family's own mitochondrial DNA, it surprisingly comes from the Great Lakes region of Africa. And I thought, how did the people from the Great Lakes get to West Africa? Well, they didn't. They left through East Africa and then were picked up by European slavers and transported around the bight of the Cape of Good Hope and then on to the colonies in the Americas. And of course, the Red Sea trade, which comes out of places that we're already very familiar with in Sudan, southern Sudan, and then people were sent down the Nile River to Cairo, which had a big slave market. In fact, these are places I've all visited, and I never thought about where's their slave market. But when I go to Savannah, I think about where's the slave market, you know? So we kind of don't extend the practices here in America to the rest of the world, but it was going on certainly in Africa and the countries adjacent to Africa. So this is one of the algorithms that we use for identifying the African empires and kingdoms and their possible role. So we first identify the possible African empire and kingdom, in this case, the ones located in West Africa, but we looked in 5 different areas of Africa: West, Central, East, South, and North, okay? And then we asked the question, did this empire or kingdom exist during the transatlantic slave trade time frame? If no, then we deleted it. If yes, then we identified the geospatial parameters of the African empire and kingdom. And we, because of the long time frame, we put things in 25-year increments. So it's almost like generational increments, you know? Then we determine the proximity or the relationship with other African empires and kingdoms. Then we detail the diplomatic, locational, socioeconomic, and environmental variables of that kingdom or empire, integrated the historical and cultural information on their participation, and identified the likely migration routes out of that kingdom, kind of going to the nearest export sites. Because for 1.5 million people to be exported out of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, it had to be an inside job. You hear me? It had to be an inside job. You just don't walk into a stranger's house and you take all his gold unless somebody told you where the gold was, right? And the trans-Saharan trade was about 10.7 million people. The Indian Ocean trade, we're not sure how many, but we're sure, again, it's in the millions. But the records are less precise because the trade flourishes, then it goes down a bit, and then it comes back up again. And then the Red Sea trade is even less well documented. But we know we're getting a steady stream from places like Darfur, you know, and all the places we're reading about in the news with warfare and so forth, yeah, they've been traumatized before. After we identify the likely migration routes out of the empire and kingdom to the nearest export site, determine the slave ship activity at specific export sites. And this is now peculiar to the transatlantic slave trade because more work has been done on that. So there are databases like the Slave Voyages database that identifies the thousands of ships and where the people came from and who was the captain, you know, and when did the ship leave and how many ports did they stop at, and then where did they dock on the American side. So that's a lot of information to piece together, but it allows us to determine the slave ship activity at specific export sites, then mesh the data on slave ships with export site and available demographic information, track the slave ships to various destinations, connect and compare historical information on sources of imported Africans, and then add this data to the African Empires and Kingdoms database, AEKD, okay? So we've been building this database with the hope that we can use it to reconstruct the internal migrations, you know? But first, we have to work backwards. So we start with, you know, what happened in America, and then the slave ship is going backwards, and it goes back to its port of connection. Who did they pick up? Where did those people come from? What were the empires and kingdoms involved? And so we're reconstructing. What routes would the people have to take? If they came from what is now Burkina Faso, and they ended up at a port in Baida, Benin, how would they have gotten there? What routes would they have taken? And so we had to put our minds in the frame set of an enslaver. You want to avoid places where your enslaved people could run away. You want to make sure that you stop frequently enough so that they can eat or have something to drink, because you don't want a lot of mortality in the enslaved. and you want to get them to market. So this sounds really crude, but it reminds me, because I grew up in Colorado and around animals, so it reminds me of on the farm out in rural Colorado when we used to herd cattle. And you herd cattle or herd, if you have any kind of animal that you're trying to get and they want to go right and you want to take them left, you know, then you really have to think ahead. Okay, what's coming up? What's over that hill? Where are the water sources, etc. And these were the supplemental databases that we consulted. We used ArcGIS. There's an Empires of West Africa database, and so for the West African sample, we did that. But there are also empires of, say, North Africa or empires of South Africa. Those databases exist as well. African History Sourcebook, African Bibliography, Cambridge Histories, historical abstracts. And one thing I must say is that the British have documented a lot of their activities because they weren't ashamed of their activities. This was building an empire. So they documented a lot of their activities, which now gives us an expanded reference database. Index Islamicus, an Oxford reference, UNESCO's General History of Africa. And UNESCO had tried to do a reconstruction of the roots of the slave. But when I consulted that database, there was no data there. So I think that, you know, if you're making a database, if you're using computational methods, everything has to come together. You have to have the right tools, the right orientation. You have to pull it together at the right time in order to get the quality of data that allows you to be prognostic. The Slave Voyages database I mentioned to you, and then the National Bureau of Economic Research Africa Project. Now, the methods we used included data entry was performed using, of course, Excel and Google Sheets, and that was just for collaboration and review. We used GIS, and that my son's area is GIS, but we put that together and then kind of expanded it after he taught us how to use the GIS software. GIS was also used to inform on natural barriers because the slaves are walking, and they're walking carrying heavy loads. You know, they're bound, so they don't have the greatest mobility. So which way do you take them? And we followed the rivers a lot because the rivers are a way to get people from the interior to the coast without much difficulty and without much interference from other groups that want to steal your gold, the people gold, okay? Geocoding of the local data and the subsequent spatial analysis of kingdoms was also performed using GIS. And then we used a Jupyter Notebook for processing the tabular data, and that was written in Python. So Python was a very convenient language. And we also used the Pandas Python library so that we had standard scripts. And Mongo Database Atlas was used so that we could store the data and document the storage. Now, this is what the biomes of Africa look like. One thing that you notice, I showed you the size of Africa. It is huge. But the ecological diversity within Africa is quite dramatic. In fact, Dobzhansky said that Africa is the most tropical of continents. What does that mean? That means that the rate of evolutionary change within Africa is accelerated because evolution proceeds very quickly in tropical settings. So we have deserts and semi-deserts and grasslands and bushlands and woodlands and forests and rainforests and lake areas. So the lake area that I mentioned to you, these are the Great Lakes right in here, okay? So that's a long distance to West Africa. So we think that my own family came across this way, then we're sent down to what is now Dar es Salaam, and then sent over to Zanzibar, and then from Zanzibar picked up and taken to Madagascar, which is right here, and then around the Cape of Good Hope, and then out to the Americas. But that's just my own family story. Everybody's got a story. And in fact, the difficulty in reconstructing the genetics of Africans of the diaspora is that African Americans are an amalgamation of African people. Lots of different, because we were not allowed, our ancestors were not allowed to retain their ethnic identities in the Americas. And in a book that Michael Gomez, a historian, wrote called Changing Our Country Marks, he says that our identities as Igbo or Yoruba or Hausa or whatever, they stayed for about 2 generations, and then they were obliterated. What obliterated them was the recognition on the part of African Americans that their ethnic identity didn't matter in terms of their current oppression, that they were being enslaved not because they were Igbo, not because they were Yoruba, not because they were Hausa, but they were being enslaved because they were Black. Kind of sobering. So in the transit, I want to talk about the patterns of forced migration of captive Africans, because these are the real results from our computational analysis and reconstruction, okay? In the transatlantic trade, which was 1500 to about 1880, more than 12.5 million enslaved Africans arrived at the coast from the hinterlands to the east and traveled often circuitously because they were avoiding other raiding parties and avoiding their family members who were coming after them to save them. And historian Sylvia Ndouf has written about the African resistance to slavery, which is something that has to be factored into our algorithms, that certain African empires and kingdoms, as well as individual lineages, mounted strong resistance to enslavement. But it was such a valuable product, and the European need for labor was so intense, it was like a frenzy. And when you look at the ships and the desire to grab people, and in the Indian Ocean trade, not only were they grabbing Africans, they were grabbing Indians, that is South Asians, they were grabbing Southeast Asians, and Africans were being imported through the Indian Ocean trade all the way to China, to Canton. That just goes along with the idea that Sam is everywhere. That's what we used to say in the community, that Black people live everywhere. Of course, that's true anyway, because all of humanity is from Africa. So, in fact, humanity lives everywhere, and humanity was originally African. Now, the earliest instance of European capture of Africans was in 1441, when 12 Africans were kidnapped and put on a Portuguese ship in Cabo Branco, Mauritania. Now the trade, this is the transatlantic trade, so this is just a piece of that millennia of enslavement. The trade represents the second of 3 stages of the triangular transatlantic trade, in which arms, textiles, and wine were transported from Europe to Africa, enslaved people picked up in Africa, taken to the Americas, and sugar and coffee from the Americas to Europe, okay? 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. And I think I mentioned the Middle Passage yesterday when I showed that hourglass and the idea that the Middle Passage was a constriction period, constricting the genetic variation of the original Africans so that you had less genetic variation in their descendants, their survivors, who got through the Middle Passage. And we can see that with the numbers, that you're starting off with 12.5 and you end up with only 10.7 surviving confinement, stress, infectious disease, nutritional deprivations, physical and psychological torture of the intercontinental migration and the dreaded Middle Passage. And those that survived were then violently disembarked in South America, in the Caribbean, in North America, in that order of magnitude. So we living in North America think it's all about us, but it's really not. We're a small piece of the puzzle. that most of the Africans went to Brazil. In fact, using US criteria, Brazil becomes a black nation. But of course, they don't use the US criteria. That would be far too political. And also the US criteria is kind of idiosyncratic. Now, less than 500,000 of the initially surviving 10.7 million Africans who successfully endured the Middle Passage ended up in North America. 500,000. So that means if we've got 40 million African Americans now, but we only came from 500,000 Africans. Okay, just think of the math. And if 2/3 of those 500,000 Africans were men, so now only 1/3 were women. So now we're talking about maybe 150,000 women, give or take. But not all of them reproduced. So maybe 100,000 reproduced. 50,000 were sterile, or they died early, or they just didn't have children, or whatever, or they killed their children. So 40,000 African Americans derived from 100,000 African mothers. I think we're a little bit closer to each other than we thought, you know? And so we probably, if we really did a comprehensive whole genome assessment of the African American population, we would find high rates of consanguinity. I didn't want to say it, but I said it, consanguinity, because we don't know who we're related to. We really don't. And so some groups like the Gullah Geechee have a history of asking your parents before you marry and asking the old people to see if there's at least 7 generations between your two lineages. But in this modern society, you know, who asks about genealogical information? They just fall in love, right? And some don't even fall in love. They just reproduce, but that's another issue. Okay, stop preaching. Okay. For many coming to North America, it was their secondary, tertiary, even quaternary destination after leaving Africa. So they had had many stops before. And previous stops may have been in Madagascar, and Mascarene, in St. Helena, out in the South Atlantic, the Caribbean, South America, and elsewhere en route to the Americas, meaning North America. The transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans was not the sole source of continental Africans to the Americas. Now, this is just showing for the transatlantic trade. I'm sorry, the print is low, but I tried to capture all of the ethnographic information and the historical information. These are where the people came from for the transatlantic trade. So this is new information. We knew that people came from Senegal and Upper Guinea and Gold Coast and Bida Benin and Bida Bonny, or Bida Biafra, what it used to be called, and West Central Africa and South Africa. But we didn't know where they originated. These are the export sites here. So here are the sources of enslaved Africans. And then we've been able to match, these are the distances in kilometers that people had to walk, okay? But we know the African empires and kingdoms associated with these sources, these original sources. And, you know, the people in one kingdom would have preyed upon maybe the people to the south of them, or to the east or the west of them. They would be, especially if they had a different religion. And they would then capture those people and then bring them to the closest export site, or the site where they had an agreement with the prevailing European power. Okay, so that's the transatlantic trade. Let's look at the trans-Saharan trade. That was 650 to 1500, with the peak from 700 to 1800, current era. is estimated to have brought 7.2 million enslaved Africans into Arabia and adjacent regions, with the actual numbers varying by century and area of origin. Now, the Sahara, if you think of the Sahara, you may think of this vast wasteland of desert, but it's actually very active, very alive. It's a bidirectional transport zone, and it's not a barrier. Sometimes we present North Africa as if it's not a part of Africa, but it is very much a part of Africa, and there's continuity between the peoples of North Africa and then going south down into the Sahel region, and then further south into Africa. The Lake Chad region and the Nile Basin supplied regional powers with enslaved Africans, provided North African and Egyptian markets with African men, women, and children via the trans-Saharan trade. And it's possible that some of these trans-Saharan captives or their descendants may have ultimately ended up in the Americas after being relocated by subsequent European colonial aspirants in North Africa and in Egypt. And so the movement of people means that when the Europeans entered the trans-Saharan trade, and they weren't the first during the trans-Saharan trade, but when they entered it with the objective of finding labor. They really wanted labor. They were emphatic about labor. And when you read the reports from the European ship owners and the businessmen, and they say, I have got to have labor to run these plantations. They didn't look to Europe for the labor. They looked to Africa. So they had an insatiable desire. And in the Sahara, because of the nature of the Sahara, there's really only 5 main routes that you can use to cross the Sahara if you're walking across the Sahara. Now, if you're driving a Land Rover and you've got all kinds of accoutrements, that's different. But if you're walking across the Sahara, oh my God. And look at these distances. Can you see that? Imagine walking 3,000 kilometers in the sand. All right, so these are the 5 routes from ancient Ghana, which is an African empire, to Marrakesh in Morocco, and on to Jadida in coastal Morocco. And those were people coming from West Africa, from Senegal, the Senegal-Gambia region. Timbuktu, Mali, and Tuat in central Algeria. So you see the lines and they just go up, from the Hausa towns to Massif and Gat, to Ghamdes and Tripoli in Libya. Look, from Lake Chad, which is at the top of Cameroon, northernmost part of Cameroon, to Muzak, to Benghazi, Libya. And all the time that people were talking about Hillary Clinton and Benghazi, I wasn't even connecting that Benghazi was a big slave port. I don't know, did you know that? I didn't know that. I didn't even connect the dots until I started looking into the transatlantic slave trade. Kadi, from Chad to Kufra to Benghazi. And that was 6,016 kilometers. And those Africans were coming from Central Africa, Chad Lake Basin, and into the rainforest. So, huge distances. And of course, the settlers were riding camels, but the enslaved Africans were walking. So they had already walked 6,000 kilometers before being sold at a slave market. This is why I call it the millennia of enslavement. Now, the patterns of enforced enslavement, again, the rise and diffusion of Islam in the 8th century onward also influenced the trade in enslaved Africans. And while Islam has rules against enslavement of Muslims, I'm telling you, when it's money, money overrules ethics. It does every time. Money overrules ethics. Increased trade in the region subsequently brought enslaved Africans into India, Arabia, and European regional colonies. And I was surprised at the actual identities of Africans still living in India, brought there because of the millennia of enslavement. Now, although evidence of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean is scant and periodic, this possibly reflects the spasmodic and periodic nature of the trade. So the trade was not a constant, steady trade as it was in the transatlantic slave trade, but it was spasmodic and episodic, and it also, there's just not enough documentation for long stretches of time. But what we do know is that in 1641, the Dutch were in the Indian Ocean, and they were tapped into the slave trade. And Europeans purchased at least 500,000, nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans from Mozambique, the Swahili coast, Madagascar, and South Asia to work on Dutch and other European colonial plantations around the world, because these European powers were not just local and not just invested in the Americas, but they were worldwide powers. That's what they sought to be. In fact, the empire, the Asian empires and kingdoms that were in the Indian Ocean region, they were thriving until the Europeans came. And Europeans shut down all of that stuff and had superior ships and shut down the Asian empires and kingdom and turned them into subordinates of their own aspirations. These are some of the export sites in the Indian Ocean trade: Mombasa, Kenya, to Southeast Asia. That's a long ride in a small boat because they use the dhows rather than the big ships of the Europeans. Cairo, Egypt, to Andalus, Eritrea, and the Gulf of Aden, to Oman and the Straits of Hormuz, and Basra, Iraq, and then Cairo, Egypt to Yemen, Oman, Iraq, Iran, India, and so on to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. So we even had slaves coming to America across the Pacific Ocean, coming into Mexico. Amazing. But that was the desire for manpower, for person power. And of course, Africans were dying, so you just replace them with other Africans. Or in this case, some Southeast Asians and some South Asians. But you can see the names here. And Indian Ocean was broad and carried people from Cape Town, Zanzibar, all up and down the East African coast, from Mozambique to the Horn of Africa. Okay, finally, the Red Sea trade. And that Red Sea trade was the smallest of the four trades. It included the Gulf of Aden and the Nile Valley trade systems. And through the Red Sea trade, captive Africans entered the Ottoman Empire. And as I told you, a colleague from Turkey just sent me a notice that the first African pilot fought in World War I, and he was fighting for the Ottoman Empire, actually against the Allies. But he apparently received a lot of commendations, and they even showed pictures of him, so he did really exist, okay? Now, the Horn of East Africa and modern Somalia and Mozambique supplied enslaved Africans to local powers in Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia, the Swahili towns, later towns like Dar es Salaam, and later Zanzibar, as well as to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean trades. So Indian Ocean and Red Sea trades kind of interacted with each other and in providing Africans for use. And these people were used as for domestic work, for agricultural work, and as sexual slaves. And many of the men were castrated. They said the mortality was about 70%. And the desire was to castrate young boys so that they had a better chance of survival. But then they became the eunuchs in the Ottoman courts. Now, until the early 20th century, These broad patterns were affected by the ebb and flow of local powers, trading networks, and the continuing spread of Islam, because Islam became a vehicle for determining the suitability of a population for enslavement. But I'm sorry to say, because I'm a practicing Muslim, but I'm sorry to say that the shahada, the testimony of acceptance of faith by some of these enslaved Africans, was not accepted by some of their Arab owners, because money overrules ethics every time. And we're a crazy species. You know, money overrules ethics. We look the other way when it benefits us financially. Now, the changing fortunes of African empires and kingdoms and the fluctuating demand for international goods that were transported along with enslaved Africans influenced both the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean trade. And these are some of the export ports. This is now the Red Sea trade. So there's the Red Sea right here. And here's the Nile right along here. I should tell you that when you fly over this area of southern Egypt and Sudan, it's fascinating because you can see the rivers that were there when the Nile was, when the Sahara was a green grassland area. You can see the riverbeds, but they're dry. I was so fascinated that when I saw them, I looked out the window of the plane. I think I was an Air Ethiopia plane, saw these riverbeds, and the only thing I could say is that song, what is it, too legit to quit. I kept saying that. Why did I say that? Because I said, this is incredible. This is too legit to quit. This is, well, I'm showing my age, but you understand, I just get excited and then some lyric pops in my mind. But it's very dramatic. Because all the rivers beds are all there. The rivers are gone. You know, so you know that the Sahara was something other than what it is now. And even though I showed you the ecological zones of Africa, they're not static. They change, they fluctuate, you know, as I'm sure you're already aware. These are some of the main trade routes. Darfur, Axum, I'm sure you've heard of Axum in Eritrea, and Massawa in Eritrea, and again, populations went on to Arabia, but the source of the populations were in East Africa, and Gamo or Gafo in southern Ethiopia to Harar, and then eastern Ethiopia to Zela in the Adwal region of Somalia, and those populations came from Eastern Africa. So Eastern and Southern and Central Africa were the sources for the Red Sea trade. And that trade had its origins during Pharaonic times, but it really picked up with the in later years. Okay, so we did the very tedious work of identifying each of these African empires and kingdoms, and I couldn't think of a nice way to display them to you, but I'm giving it a try here on the next slide. But this is just to show I've got the paperwork to back up this slide. So it's not a handful of empires and kingdoms, you see? And every single one of these kingdoms was involved in the millennia of enslavement. I don't know if it means they were bad people or they were just good businessmen. They surely had a short-term perspective. And when the British began industrialization, then the desire was to have the desire of the British was to rule the world. And so the British stopped the transatlantic slave trade, but they also stopped it in the Indian Ocean and in the Mediterranean. Because they didn't want the flow of goods and services unless they were under the control of the British. That's how you become a world power. You control everything, okay? So you can see here, this is the AEKs, the X, affected by the transatlantic trade. These are some of them. And then some were affected by the transatlantic as well as the trans-Saharan, like the Congo Kingdom, or the Luba, or the Yeke, or the Songhai, the Mali, or ancient Ghana, which is also known as Ouagadougou. And then in North Africa, large numbers of kingdoms. In East Africa, East African kingdoms were involved in the Indian Ocean trade as well as the Red Sea trade. And then down in South Africa, those kingdoms were involved primarily in the Indian Ocean trade, but some also became involved in the transatlantic trade. And because Europeans were everywhere, they were ubiquitous because they had the best sailing vessels. They had the technology. So they were picking up Africans wherever they could get them. So the next step for us is to insert genomic data into this millennia of enslavement. And we started looking at mitochondrial DNA using something called the Eli Jackson database. This is from Bert Eli and the late Bruce Jackson, and they had collected 4,000 African mitochondrial DNA samples. Then we were also getting Y chromosome information and autosomal DNA, classifying it by geospatial region, because Africa's so big, even with the computers, I can't figure out what's going on. So we divided it into regions, said we'll determine the patterns of genomic diversity in West Africa, in North Africa, in East Africa, Central Africa, and South Africa. And our goal is to reconstruct the historic and contemporary genomics of diverse African communities. And I hope we'll be able to put it all together. But it's not going to be a single theme. It's going to be diversity, because if there's one thing that characterizes Africa, it's diversity at every single level. And someone came to visit me today that was talking about diversity in the centromeres, you know. I forgot his name, but he came to, Chuck, yeah. And so diversity, because we are an African people, all of us. I mean, our roots are in Africa. And don't you just love the findings of ancient Europeans? And when the artist makes a reconstruction, they kind of look like your cousin. I just love it. And I wish we could get this down to everyday people, because then they would not make a big deal about being alabaster or being hypopigmented or being, you know, they make a big deal about being really very fair. And they stop using that word, because that implies that if you're not light, you're unfair. Anyway, our next steps. We're going to break down the problem into smaller and manageable parts by identifying the genomic information geospatially. So that is known as decomposition. Then, of course, we're looking for pattern recognition and modeling. As we decompose the existing genomic database, as fragmented as it is, we're still looking for patterns. And we think that if we tie this to the historical information, we'll begin to make some sense out of it. For example, in the literature, it says that people from the Chad Basin are not represented in North America. But the author had no idea why. And we looked at the Chad Basin, that is that area around Lake Chad. Then we said, well, of course they're not represented in the transatlantic slave trade, because they were involved in the trans-Saharan slave trade, you know? And they were being protected by the Empire of Songhai, which was the big boy on the block in that region. You know? Of course, when these big empires and kingdoms broke up, they do what happens everywhere where the big empires break up. Lots of small fiefdoms appear, and you get a king on every block, right? Lots of warlords and other little small entities that try to make that they're bigger than what they are. and they compete with each other. So the situation gets worse for the local people, but better for those who are hoping to exploit these conditions. Then we focus on we look for similarities and regularities among the regions of Africa. We focus on the essential details, ignore the irrelevant ones like the more recent migrations of non-Africans into continental Africa. This is an irrelevant point in terms of the genomics of the people of Africa, because we've lived for so long in Africa, that's why. It's not that the people are irrelevant, it's that their presence there is irrelevant, because they just showed up, you know. Kind of if you were doing a study of Native American peoples, and then you said, but let's look at the African Americans. But it's kind of irrelevant, because Native Americans have been on this continent for so long, you know, that the African American presence is not a big deal. Algorithm design and automation, we want to create the steps used to complete our task, use computers to perform the task efficiently and accurately, and then we want to evaluate the solution and its outcome. And our goal, of course, initially is to reconstruct the genetic profile of Africans of the Atlantic diaspora. But in the process, we will reconstruct areas of Africa that contributed to that millennia of enslavement. And remember the exploding Africa. Just about every, I don't know what area of Africa is not affected, that is peopled, you know? And then documentation. And you know that if you don't write up your stuff, it's like you never did it. So we were going to write up our assessments of the genomic consequences of the millennia of enslavement. And I think that, yeah, that takes me to the end. So I thank you all, and I thank my Quad Grid Lab research team, the members and our many collaborators. And I want to add to this that since I've been blessed to come here to Davis, have met so many bright people, I invite you to join us in figuring out what is going on in Africa, because it's not a story that can be told from one part of the continent or by one person, but it has to be a multidisciplinary, integrated approach. And so we welcome collaborators. Thank you all very much. Do we have time for questions? Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Thanks so much for the talk. I have lots of questions, but I'll start with a clarifying one, which is I didn't quite get, how did you get at the sources of the populations?
So we went back, we used geospatial, we used ArcGIS, and we used that to map out where the plains were located, where the rivers were located, and what existing paths were there when that information was available. And then we calculated what would be the population living in this area that would have come down the river in order to get to an exit location that was known. Now, the exit locations were known for the transatlantic trade, and the exit locations were elaborated for the trans-Saharan. The Indian Ocean exit locations were kind of partially known, but you know it's going to be on the coast, you know, so it's going to be Dar es Salaam, for example. It's going to be Mombasa. It's not going to be Nairobi. That's too far inland. But if populations were coming from the center of Africa, they would have to go particular routes. They'd have to avoid the rainforest, go up toward the plains, follow the rivers in order to get to the coast. So it was a probability assessment that we made.
So do you make like an assessment also, because there were some really far distances like you noted, right? Like, do you make an assessment of like how far would it make sense for them to go? Or?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So there's like an upper limit as well, or?
Apparently
there's a radius, something like a radius.
Maybe the upper limit would have been 10,000 miles, but nobody did 10,000 miles. The highest we found was 6,000 miles across the Sahara, but again, with adequate stops at oases. So for the trans-Saharan, our assumption was that, okay, how far can the human being walk before they have to stop for water? You know, and what were the temperatures have been? And what about the terrain? And could they walk at night? Or would they have to camp out at night? And the oases are well located. So those are static. And the departure points would have been close to assembly areas. The assembly areas were the African empires and kingdoms. And then from those assembly points, they then migrated. It was forced migration across the desert, but following well-known ways. So the exit points for transatlantic were well-known. We just had to calculate where they would have come from the interior of the country, of the continent. The exit points for the trans-Saharan were known, and the stopping points, because the Sahara is, you know, much more lethal than the grasslands if you're walking. But we just tried to piece it together, and there are probability statements, but then we looked at the mileage. How many kilometers would it take to go from this point A to point B? So the movement in the trans-Saharan was always up and then over, up and then over, or toward the coast and then over, because Cairo became kind of a central site for the distribution of those slaves who had actually come from way in the interior. Yeah. For the Red Sea, it was a little fuzzier because the documentation, there wasn't as much, but we looked at the morphology of the Red Sea, realizing that people were going to be going down the Red Sea towards Cairo. And because of its antiquity, it was going to be longer. They could reach as far as Darfur, and Darfur seemed to be the route. Then you got to Khartoum, and then from Khartoum you could go straight down to Cairo. Okay. Yeah, so it's a little different strategy for each slave trade, but you know the dynamics. Some things were static, like the condition of the people, and then we read lots of biographies of slave traders and what their strategy was. So we kind of got in their heads, and then stories about the enslaved and what had happened in their families. And it was very heartbreaking. I don't know, that part I wouldn't really recommend if you're soft-hearted, you know, because when you read something, your brain can't distinguish between it happened to him or it happened to me. So I've been through the millennia of enslavement, and I didn't want to be, but I was, because I was reading all these reports, you know, and so much so that this summer I was in the hospital twice. Now, I couldn't say, I'm in the hospital because I have millennia of enslavement syndrome. No, I had double pneumonia, but I'm sure that my immune system was crashed because of the stress of reading about the horrific conditions that people endured generation after generation after generation. You see what I'm saying? But it was important to do this to finally produce that exploding map, which really said, this is what's going on. People are coming from everywhere. So how does this pay off? And I don't know if this is part of your question, but I wanted to talk to you about it. How does this pay off is that in the Americas, among North American, African Americans, we find greater African regional diversity than we expected to find. Now, I'm just looking at mitochondrial DNA. And so how do I explain this? Either we came from more regions than people anticipated, or something's wrong with the science. I think the latter is false and the former is true, that the science is correct, but that we haven't evaluated where African peoples really came from. And as I said, when I test, when in my family, we had a myth that we were part Native American. And, you know, whose family doesn't have that, right? Well, we're part Native American. No, we're not. We're African, but we're from the Great Lakes region. And when I figured out, okay, how do we get from the Great Lakes region to a coastal region to be transported? And why does information about Madagascar keep appearing in my maternal family's lineage? Then now I finally put it together. Oh, because there was an Indian Ocean trade. And so there's a mechanism that's now in place for arriving. What does that mean? It means from my maternal side, I picked up some risk alleles for chronic kidney disease. And from my father's side, I picked up a different set of risk alleles because his people apparently came from West or Central Africa. Both areas were resistant to, both of the risk alleles were responsive to Trypanosoma rhodesiensis or Trypanosoma gambiensis. But the trypanosome is present throughout Africa, and these APOL1 risk alleles protect against it. But somehow, I managed to get both my mother's and my father's risk allele. So I'm a double heterozygote, which for me has made me understand why I got kidney disease. You know, like, it kind of like, I know it wasn't my fault. It was going to happen, and that the genetics predispose, but the hypertension pulls the trigger. So it's helped me in my understanding of genetics and chronic disease health disparity by understanding the demography of my ancestral populations. That's just me. Who am I? I'm nobody. But imagine if we could do that for all of us, so we could make sense out of our liabilities, and in a way that we could intervene early enough so I never became hypertensive, so I still had the gun, but it was never loaded. You see? So this is why knowledge is so important, and the reconstruction is so important. Otherwise, we just repeat the errors generation after generation, and we continue to feel disenfranchised, and we don't know why. And we blame everybody else, but really there's a deeper meaning. And I think genetics allows us to get at the deeper meaning. Okay, I'm sorry for another lecture.
Thank you for that. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the stories that we tell and whether and how you've thought about resilience as part of this story, including genetic resilience, and what might the benefits of looking for genetic resilience be, but also what might the potential risks or harms be, especially given the corporate interests who may have a desire to know what those resilience alleles might be.
Yeah, I don't know about genetic resilience. I know about epigenetic resilience. And I do know that when my daughter-in-law and my daughter and I were publishing some papers on epigenetics, and we decided to go bold, go hard or go home, right? So we said, we're doing the epigenetics of chattel slavery and institutionalized racism. And it's like, and yeah, we dare you to publish it. So at first, the reviewers said, this is terrible. Black people are stupid. They need to concentrate on education. And so I just smiled when that review came, because I said, now I can really get the editor-in-chief. And I said, you need to get rid of those reviewers. Those are terrible things. How can you say that? This is an important topic. And they backed down. So anyway, we got 3 papers out of it. But we said, we don't want to publish a woe is me, look how bad we've been treated, look how terrible the epigenetic profiles are, without a paper on resilience. So the other part of the story, it's like the other side of the coin, is resilience. And the two things go together to have a whole coin, back, the heads and the tails. So resilience has been a part of the genomic message in the sense of the epigenomic message. As far as specific genes that are resilience genes, I do not know. I would like to know, because the lifespans of people of African descent are shorter in this country, and it's been proven that the telomeres at the end of the chromosomes start to unravel faster. There's an area of DC called Anacostia. So it's the hood, you know Anacostia. So it's, and for young people living in Anacostia, because they're exposed to high rates of violence and within the house and outside of the house, and low income areas and low opportunity and poor educational standards and so forth. So their telomeres are unraveling. So they, you look at them and they're not going to live that long. That their lifespan is probably, the lifespan of their chromosomes is going to be shorter. And the lifespan of the chromosomes is correlated with actual lifespan. And of course, this has been known for many decades that African Americans tend to have shorter lifespan. And it's not clear why, but it's a reality, and it's something that we can do something about, at least as genomicists. We can begin to investigate that. So I think that the payoff for this kind of research on ancestry and questions of response to stress will have decades of benefit. But we need to approach it systematically, and we need to do it with an engaged community, because none of these questions, including the ones that I've looked at, are simple questions with simple answers. They have historical attributes. Did you all see that movie, The Woman King? I don't know, some of you saw it. Yeah, it was about the Benin Empire. And of course, it wasn't correct. It was a movie. It was a movie, so it's going to be full of lies. And Hansenin, who was the king of Benin at that time, the king of Alada, that's what he was actually king of. And he wrote letters trying to dissuade the Europeans, he said, from buying slaves. He said, I'll sell you vegetables. I'll sell you red palm oil. You need red palm oil for your machines, right? I've got it, They said, no, we need slaves. And the slave trade was so lucrative, he subsequently went back and started selling slaves. Because if he didn't sell slaves, he was going to be a slave. Because that's also how things happen. If you're not selling, then you are the sold. Especially as you get closer to the coast. And Alada was pretty close to the coast. So it would have been very easy for him and his people to become enslaved. In fact, when the Dahomey women warriors, the Aguja, came down, now it's not like it was in the movie. They act like they had autonomy, but that's women's lib stuff. That's not true. They worked for the king, and when they came down to Alada from Dahomey, which is about 30 miles, and they killed the Alada king, chopped off his head, and his son, who was he was to become the new king. They had been fighting a war, and they said that those women warriors were so tough that the French explorers say blood was running in the streets. They were really fierce. But this was, Africans killing Africans, but nonetheless, it was really fierce. In fact, the only reason we really know about the women warriors is because they fought the French, and they gave the French a run for their money, and were killing French men. And so, so that's the real reason we know about them. Anyway, the son who was going to become a king, he said that he would leave for America with his 6,000 warriors. And so he did, and they went to Santo Domingo. And his son became Toussaint Louverture, who ran the revolution in Haiti. And somebody related to him is related to my husband. So my husband never lets me forget that he's a member of the royal family, and I should call him sir. But it's, so the connections are really interesting and unexpected, I mean, we were brought here because we were valuable, and we're still valuable. We need to be the topics of research, because we're all valuable. But we've had this imbalance in the United States. we can balance it out in a few generations if you guys do your job. Okay. No more questions? Okay. All right, very good. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.